Board games. Welcome to Virtual Tabletop Gaming Live. I am Bez, and we are going to talk not just about board games, but about city building board games. We have three fantastic games. We have James Naylor, we have Zach, and we have Gil Hova, creators of city building games, or are they? We will find out. But let's start by talking about these wonderful people. So James, could you introduce yourself quickly?
Absolutely. So I'm James Naylor. I'm a board game designer, and I've developed a game called Magnate: The First City, which I launched at a Kickstarter last year, and will hopefully be sort of arriving with backers in December.
Very exciting times. And how about yourself, Zach?
Thanks, Bez. Yeah, I'm Zach. I am a hobby publisher. I do not do this full-time. I just do it for fun. I designed a little game called Lots, a tower building game. It's not exactly a city building game, but thematically it does share some elements.
And I'm sure we'll get into that, like how much city does there need to be for it to be a city building game? And when you talk about doing it for fun, everyone does it for fun. Isn't that the way, Gil?
Yeah, although sometimes I question that at times. But my name's Gil Hova. I'm a board game designer and publisher. I publish all my games under Formal Ferret Games. You might know me from my game The Networks, and I have a new game called High Rise that is, at least I like to call it, a skyscraper building game.
And so we've got very different approaches to what could be called a city building game. And what is a city building game? So I came up with some vague terms that I would like you in turn to refute or to agree with. So I thought a game which focuses on the growth and development of a city. Gil, do you have anything to add?
Not really. I mean, to me, a definition is only really good for figuring out how to like break that definition.
Right.
It's one of those things where you can't break the rules until you know the rules. So for me, that's the use of a definition. I'm not that into like everything has to be in its own neat little box. It's more like let's figure out what the line is so we can figure out what the best way is to cross the line into uncharted territory.
Sure, but for the sake of what we're doing today, James, I mean, how would you define it? Would you agree with this broadly?
So yeah, I think I definitely broadly agree with Gil on this one, because I think inherent to exactly what Gil's saying, really, to any bending of genre and doing anything innovative, there needs to be like an existing creative constraint. So the moment that there is a kind of city building game where you're recognizably building a city and you're doing something fairly expected that we might think about, for example, probably heavily influenced by computer games like SimCity, which is now that's a game that's like 30 years old. Then once you've got some notion of that, you can then begin deconstructing and playing with it. So, and actually, the reason I wouldn't want to get more restricted in the definition I think you've put forward of the idea of it's a game which focuses on the growth and development of a city is because even that alone can be explored in loads of concepts, right? In a different way. So you have a medieval city, you have a modern city, you have a city on Mars. All of those could become city building games. And the commonality would be this notion of a growth of habitation. So I actually think even within that idea, there's actually a lot you can kind of unpack about what cities are and what development and growth is. So I think that's why I think that's a fine definition to get us going.
That's a really interesting point, that it could be to do with developing a new colony. Mm-hmm. And Zach, obviously your game, it's a little bit less to do with the pricing of these things or the skyscrapers that go on in Gil's game, but yours is more to do with
the actual construction of buildings. Correct. Mm-hmm. So I actually have two opinions on this. I think that city building as a theme is very broad and just can be anything where you are constructing, building, growth, as you said, Bez. But mechanically, certain things that I'm sure we'll get into later fit a little more into the building feel of things, like efficiency engines, tiling, things. Now, I do agree with Gil that we have these definitions so that we can push the boundary of them. but I also do think it's good to have that solid foundation,
so to speak,
jump off of.
No, that sounds like a great point. So we've got this foundation now. As a start, Zach, your game maybe has the least complexity,
The least.
and I don't know why I say maybe. I was going to say it. Maybe it's also the least intrinsically. It has to be a city building game because it feels like it almost could be an abstract thing.
Oh, absolutely. For the most part, the theme of this game with building is solely on the fact that you are stacking blocks. Now, unlike most stacking games, you're usually focusing on the dexterity element. This is more of a three-dimensional puzzle. You're trying to put it in the place that's going to pay off the best, and that's actually how it fits better into the city building. Efficiency. It's about the spatial recognition, the color coordination, and there's just a small bit of don't knock this building over, otherwise.
And so,
Yeah,
what made you decide that this was going to be city building as opposed to growing a coral reef or anything else?
It's actually interesting that you said reef. I remember working on a game with Emerson.
yeah.
Originally, that was a city game, and it was Reef, a very successful game where you're placing the colored tokens and again, just trying to be as efficient with your moves as possible. That in the beginning was a city game.
Sure, and so it
was me
highlights the
choosing
fact
for
that
this
these
to be
games can be interchanged sometimes. So what made you decide I want to theme my game around city building?
This would have been the first game I made that was family friendly. Previous to this, everything was about fighting each other with weapons and shooting rocket launchers, and then I became a father. I did not want to make a game where I was going to point a flamethrower at my child. Something cute and approachable to families. When I started gluing all these little blocks together to make the little three-dimensional tetrominos, it just felt like a building game. It's heavily inspired by Tetris, but for legal reasons, I will call it Tetrisant. As I messed around with that, the game started to form around it. We kind of just went with the cute, chibi art, family-friendly, approachable construction site theme.
So it sounds like it really flowed naturally. Now, Gil, same to you. You have dabbled in a lot of themes in the past. You've done abstract word games. You've done warmongering people, trying to profit off of things. You've done TV. Why city building games?
That's just what the mechanisms. That's the direction they were pointing to. You know, I knew at the start that this game was going to have to be about greed and capitalism on some level, because I started with an auction mechanism, and long story short, if you don't know the saga of my auction mechanism, it's pretty funny. There's an auction mechanism that I've been trying to put into various games, and it just doesn't work. I wind up taking the auction mechanism out of the game, and the game winds up standing on its own. So that was Battle Merchants, that was the Networks, and that was High Rise. All three of those rejected the auction mechanism, but the sort of the legacy auction mechanism lives on in some ways. But the auction mechanism is almost like a penny auction. It's really brutal, which is one of the reasons why it doesn't really stick around in games. It's really hard to keep it in the game, but it kind of leans towards making the players feel like greedy capitalists, and I think that's why I wanted it to be a game about specifically not just city building but building skyscrapers.
Because that skyscraper is almost the epitome of capitalism as well.
Yeah. Yep. It's a literal monument to someone's wealth. Yes.
James, now your game has a really interesting story. Do you want to go into it? What provoked you to dabble in this theme?
Well, quite a few things kind of came together all at once for Magnate, and I'm certainly someone who is, I think, broadly a theme-first designer. So I like to pick a kind of subject matter in general that I'm very interested in and see if I can build a game around it and find what kind of mechanics fit. And I was very influenced at the time of what was going on in my hometown in Croydon, because it was going through a huge amount of development was going on. And I ended up, because I was partly working on a newspaper project that I've been working on for a long time, I knew a lot about property, like a huge amount about property and how it worked. And I'd kind of wanted to make a game for a while, and then suddenly something occurred to me. I said, well, wouldn't it be great if there was like a property game that was more realistic, that was somehow based on how property actually kind of works, knowing a bit more about the industry, just from being like a hobbyist, effectively, in the property development, which is the most uncool thing you can imagine, really. And then I'm joking. And then at the same time, I thought, I loved SimCity, and I was like, well, what if there was a game that brought these things together and could be, and partly in my mind, of something that would have some kind of like the positive bits of like Monopoly energy. So what I mean is, like, when people, they love the feeling of like getting cash, of making money, of making profit, that kind of thing. Could you build a game? Capitalism, absolutely. And take a different approach to Gil here. I was like, let's celebrate it. And then and I sort of decided to bring, and then they just sort of all came together at once. And I was like, oh, what if there was a game where you're a property developer in a city, but the city expands in an emergent way? So like, what is best for me for making the most money out of my property development kind of accidentally helps everyone else, because it kind of changes the market for everyone else. And so a lot of stuff started falling into place quite naturally, like this big idea of, well, obviously, how do property markets work? Well, they work in bubbles, basically. So that means that you're going to have is prices are going to keep rising to the point they become unsustainable, and there has to be a market crash, because there was no way for me to like create this game without that on some level. It felt like it had to be in there, and that took a lot of work, because as Gil said, I think it's such a true thing of this issue of like, oh, there's a mechanic I really want to use. I almost had the inverse problem. I really want to do this, and there are so many mechanics that don't quite deliver this. And so it was, so that's kind of where my game Magnate came from.
So whereas Gil was trying to build a game around this mechanism that just falls away after it's done its job of being a supportive framework, you were just hunting for that elusive thing to bring your game to life.
Absolutely. Beautiful way to put it.
The interesting thing is that skyscrapers are a big testimony to New York, where Gil and Zach live. And James, you are based basically in London. Just, I don't know how many miles away from me, maybe 20 miles away.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of this is about our personal stories of, we live in cities, we live in really big cities. Do you think that there's a representation problem? How does this theme reflect our personal stories? And how much does this game reflect your personal story? And do you think it could be more accessible, or does it reflect everyone? Let's start with Gil.
So I have a couple of thoughts here, a couple of stories. First off, I'm in Jersey City, which is a city that's directly across the water from Manhattan. So if you were to go to Battery Park at the very southernmost tip of Manhattan, and then jump into the Hudson and swim across the Hudson in a straight line, you would emerge in Jersey City. So it really is not terribly far, and it's just because King George decided the Hudson River was a border that Jersey City is considered a different city, and in a different state. So, but so people are like, oh, you're not really in New York City, but there's all these weird little exceptions that happen, like the Statue of Liberty. If you look at a map, the Statue of Liberty is right next to Jersey City, and it's only because of New York's clout that New York says, oh, we'll make an exception. The Statue of Liberty is in New York, even though it's really close to Jersey City, much closer than it is to Manhattan. To say nothing where the New York Giants and the New York Jets play, which is maybe, I think, 10 miles west of where I am, so like even further away from where I am, and obviously where Manhattan is. So, so there's that sort of introduces like the little politics of power that are involved when you have a big city, the little politics of pride, these little tiny things that become about ego. And
Well, see, I'm actually in New York, but you can actually see it from where you are.
oh yeah. I mean, the only reason I can't see the Statue of Liberty is there's buildings in the way. Other than that, I'd like have a straight shot at it. It really seriously. So and yeah, I'm maybe like a 10-minute walk from the waterfront where I have a beautiful view of Lower Manhattan. But the thing about that is, being in Jersey City, that's actually kind of like a personal backyard of Jared Kushner. He has a lot of buildings here. So there's a lot of stories of huge property developers getting tax abatements, tax deferments to their constructions because they promise to have all these low-income housing units in their buildings, and then they go up with no low-income housing units, and there's nothing that the city really does about it. And it's kind of the newer Jersey City administration is a little bit better at that than the previous administration, but still, kind of a long way to go. So, we're seeing the gentrification. We're seeing as buildings go up, we see rents go up and people moving out and that sort of thing. Bez, just as a sidetrack, also not even a sidetrack, but the second answer. You talked about representation, and I usually like to have a good amount of representation in my games. Honestly, I feel like I haven't gone far enough with representation in my games, but I asked about it because in High Rise, I want people to play villains. I want them to play awful people. And I asked someone who was effectively a sensitivity consultant, and she looked at it and she said, this could be kind of problematic, if you start putting minorities and start casting them as villains, that's not going to be so good. And that's why there's no human figures in High Rise, because I don't want to villainize any groups of people, and I don't want the game to be all white men either.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's undeniable, though, that in having a city that's based off where we live, I mean, we are based in UK, USA, and that's not going to be reflective of the city structure elsewhere. James, I understand that a lot of this came from your hobbyist work, as you put it. But do you think it's particularly reflective of London or your story, or do you think this is just a generic city thing?
I think we're massive products of our environment in many ways. So I actually think the particular story of Croydon kind of is definitely an influence on Magnate. And I thought it was so interesting what Gil said about being in New Jersey, because Croydon is pretty much the New Jersey of London. So in the 1960s, it went through this massive transformation where it went from being like a regular suburb into what was called, amusingly by British people who had never been to America, mini Manhattan, because it suddenly was filled with loads of high-rise towers as a deliberate attempt to move office space out of central London and into another area, right, to kind of regenerate it. And Croydon has this reputation of being like all the people who live in inner London. The idea is they kind of look down at the Croydonians because they're the very much, as we just talked about just before this recording began, we talked about the bridge and tunnel crowd. Yep. And I think like that's Croydon people are like seen like that. Mm-hmm. And it also has this reputation of being like a kind of mini financial center away from the main one, right, in the city of London or Canary Wharf. So it's been really interesting for me to see, but it's a place where recently is kind of rejuvenating. There's been loads of high-rise buildings have all shot up, especially residential buildings. In fact, I live in one of those on the 31st floor. So for me, it was like an intrinsic part of the story. Mm. As to your question about and I just so really fascinating to hear that Gil is a New Jersey resident, because something about that I think is something really interesting in terms of influence for both of us of where we live. Mm-hmm. And the representation question is a really interesting one for me, because I'm very much the same opinion. As much as possible, I like to make a game that anyone can project themselves into, and I think that's why I think sometimes representation is a fascinating challenge, because in some subject matters you've got to have some art of different people. But you also want to create an experience that's like very unbounded for people, so they can just imagine themselves in the situation. And actually, Magnate is almost completely without any human representation at all. So it's all almost within the mind's eye, except for the backers who paid to have their face on the money. They're the only people.
Oh, that's clever. That's really clever. I like that.
Exactly right. So for me, like I think that's a critical thing, because I think games are fundamentally for everyone, and you've got to project them in. And I would say the satire in Magnate is maybe a bit lighter than perhaps in something like High Rise. So we created a set of companies instead that players play as, and each of the companies has has a backstory which is slightly hair raising, in the sense that which we wrote in order to actually brief artists about what their logos should be.
Sure.
So we created the company histories first to do that.
Companies has its own kind of parody of a style of company that's going on, whether it's an energy company or whatever.
Exactly. So we wanted to parody them in different ways. So, for example, there's like one that's more like an establishment. There's clearly like a huge like property management firm, like asset management company. Another one that's like a kind of is sort of like a very Silicon Valley-esque company where everything is like very trendy, but they're selling tiny houses to millennials, basically. So it's a kind of like there's quite a lot of these kind of ideas going on in it, and it was also interesting to hear Gil talk about his approach to how to do that. And we've obviously had some slightly similar thoughts about like satire and how to play with that. The thing is, and that raises another question for me, which I think is really interesting when you encounter real world problems like gentrification that Gil mentioned, is that satire in games is really hard because of this problem that you want people to identify and have just fun playing it. If you make people feel like they're like horrible all the way through, that's a challenge to the fun. And I always think it's really interesting how that's why satirical games, I think, have always had a hard time, in a way that like satirical literature is a slightly more straightforward exercise, which I think is interesting.
I think that in itself could be an entirely separate conversation, the notions of satire. And I don't want to get too far into the notion of representation or personal stories, but it is worth noting that even with something as non-human as a city, there is a very much a mindset of this is where I've grown up, this is going to reflect us. Now, in something as abstract as your game, Zach, do you think that your game belies your story at all? Do you think that you would have made it had you been living in a village?
Probably not. So I'm originally from Queens, New York, which I think in 2018 was voted the most diverse city in the entire world. And the characters in the game are not characters that you're playing. No one is taking on the role of those characters, but I did make sure to have just an incredible amount of representation as far as your coworkers, people on the job with you, who you're all on the same job, you're all working together, you're all building the same building, but they're going to screw you over some way, as anyone you work with at some point does. So I would say that definitely does represent my background, my story. Now, I am a maintenance worker professionally, so I am on the work site every day, fixing things, and just arguing with my coworkers about, you really built me into a corner here. So definitely a little bit of love went into that as far as putting the theme onto this otherwise abstract game.
So it sounds like, as a player, are you attracted to the theme? Like, would you say that you started making it as a family game, like Zach?
Right. I definitely started making it as the family game, but as I got more into it, and I started enjoying the mechanism, because as we saw here, Gil starts with the mechanisms, James starts with the theme, and there's no.
I mean, I don't always start with the mechanism.
I was just referencing the
this particular game. Yes, yep.
The two particular that we're discussing. Mm-hmm. There's no wrong way to do it. It's whatever you first draw inspiration from. And
there's a million other ways on top, of course.
Absolutely. It takes me back to something, I forget who used to describe it this way, but there's certain ways to design a game. You're either a painter or a sculptor. You start with a blank canvas and you just keep and more paint at it. You can cover this up if you need to. But if you're a sculptor, you work with this huge piece of clay, and you're just chipping away at it, chipping away at the big idea until it becomes something more succinct. With my game, I definitely started with a small blank canvas, and I just kept throwing stuff at it. Even though it was a small game, I had been working on this one for about 5 years before I pulled the trigger to actually make it.
So, Gil, and same question to you. How do you feel about this player about this theme as a player?
I think the challenge is that there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of games out there with this theme, and as a player, I'd have to know more. Like, I'd have to know, well, okay, it's a game about constructing buildings, city building game, if you will. What else, you know? And you can see with our three games are very, very, very different. Because there's so much room to explore in this situation. But our three games also have some unique hook to them, you know, be it my game, which is about managing corruption and moving around a time track, or be it James's game, where it's about managing a potential bust in the market, or Zach's game, which is about the joy of constructing these physical, tangible, tactile pieces. You know, they have very, very different hooks to them. And I think as a player, you know, it's important to... as a designer and a publisher, it's important to emphasize those hooks so the players can really understand that. And one of the reasons why that first high-res campaign struggled so much is because I didn't have that hook clearly defined.
And James, how would you feel about this theme as a player?
Well, I think for me, I always loved city building because I was absolutely a SimCity fanatic back in the day. So, and the more complex, the better. Particularly for me, it kind of reached a peak in sort of the fourth SimCity game where you sort of were going down to micromanaging individual school budgets, that kind of thing. That's the kind of thing I really liked. So, naturally for me, it sort of all fitted, and I found it kind of easy space to work in. I think particularly with the property market, it was very. I think Gil's so right. He says it's a very creative space. There's so much to do there. I think my approach was definitely to kind of build on what Zach was saying, very much a sculptor type approach. In the sense, I started with just like a stupidly large amount of mechanics.
Just a big concept. Yep.
So big and like massive and sprawling. The first prototype, also because I was a very inexperienced designer at the time, I made some insane decisions. Like my initial prototype had a board that was 2 meters by 1 meter. I mean, why did I think that was ever going to be practical? But it did mean we had everything made out of Lego, including some buildings that were this size. So like a kind of like Simon style special edition version of Magnate right out of the gate. So.
Although that has been a popular trend now, the game box that takes up an entire calyx. So
a miniature the size of a toddler is the new hot thing. So I think that there's how you can call that a miniature anymore, I don't know. It's just a statue at this point. And I worked in like that, and I actually found that. But I think because of my background knowledge, I found that actually quite easy to keep iterating it, even though it took ages. It took so long. But I found it quite easy to work with, and that made me a huge believer in general about spending a lot of time with your subject matter just for inspiration, which I think is sometimes like a really underestimated value of it. And I think what's really interesting hearing both you and Gil and Zach is that both of you clearly know a lot about your subject, and that clearly seems to have really helped you in terms of the long design. Even if in this particular example, Gil, you took a more mechanical first type approach. And I'm a big believer in that. So I think knowledge is the key for me and that kind of thing.
I mean, it sounds like you all have a connection to this. And I think, Gil, you mentioned some really interesting points about needing to differentiate your thing, whether it's the tactile stuff in lots or whether it's the high-rise buildings or the boom and bust. But even though there are so many city building games, yet they continue to prevail. So could we close up by thinking about what continues these being so popular? Why does it remain with us? James?
So for me, I think cities are a deeply powerful theme. And I think it comes in, and I think you can kind of find out why partly in computer games like SimCity, because I think they've been with us longer than like the majority of city building board games have been, I think. And that's because, and I would say that what's in them is this kind of powerful idea about creativity and emergence. So a city is something that on the one hand you plan, you lay it out and you say, well, okay, we're going to have maybe some residential there, some commercial there. Here's where the roads are going to be. But on the other hand, it's a space in which other people take over and they populate it with things. So for me, one of the most powerful things about Magnate was I wanted it to be somehow impossible to predict what the city would look like from first principles. So when you start, every city is like completely unique. It's almost like it's generating some kind of unique world each time. And I think there's something in the notion of cities about that idea that you're planning out something which then emerges into something somehow more than it is, which is so in heart of the theme for me that will always be popular, I think, to some extent. Although, for that same reason, as Gil says, you've got to then try and stand out in a crowded market because it's popular for a good reason, and lots of people are going to be working in it. But I think if you can nail that feeling at the heart of it, I think that goes a long way.
And the city becomes its own organism, it becomes this whole thing, and then we have this joy of thinking of all the people. And Gil, why do you think that this city building theme continues to prevail?
I mean, most themes that have inherent, at least from the perspective of a strategy board game, inherent competition, I think usually work well in board games. And with city building games, I mean, a city implies that you've got a limited parcel of land on which to build. So it's not like if you can't build over here, well, you can just go over there. A lot of times in a city, well, you can't go over there because that's water over there. You just can't build there. So I think that's a big reason why just inherently this idea of limited space is a big reason why.
Sure, in competitive games, having that scarcity of resources.
Yeah.
And Zach, why do you believe there are lots of city building games?
Ooh,
You were
very
supposed to frame it
nice.
that time. Nice. So there's a lot of every theme. Every theme has been done multiple times, but something about city building lands very middle of the road. You've got fighting games. Fighting games are always competitive, and that's divisive. Some people don't want to battle each other. You've got other things that are a little less interactive, but when it comes to a city, it's about control. People love having that, look what I made, look what I've created, and I did it better than you, but not in a way where I've destroyed you or shamed you in any way. It's creative, and it touches something about the player, and just it hits all those desires successfully and satisfyingly playing the game.
I'm really enjoying the diversity of opinions. There's probably a million more reasons that we could talk about just for an hour why these are good. But, on the other flip side, there are some potential problems. And when you're designing this kind of game, there must be certain things that you need to be aware of. Zach, do you think there were any particular challenges?
Absolutely. So originally when I designed this game, and the reason it took so long for me to bring to market, I had pitched it around to other companies, and they, taken it for months at a time, tried it out, they loved it, and then it always came down to the dollars and cents. Too expensive for what it was. Well, at the end of the day, it's a family game. So the biggest challenge was getting these wood blocks, these three-dimensional wood blocks, not only to fit nicely together, but also to fit into a cost-effective box. So that took a long time to plan out, and it was something that I did not work around while designing the game. Like, the designs came and I went with it, and I'm having fun, I'm excited, and then how am I going to do this? No clue. That was a learning experience afterwards. The second thing I would say is a bit of a regret would actually be the name. So I got very hung up on the name Lots because it's made with Tetris blocks. It's actually spelled out with the shapes in the game. And that was just one of the original inspirations. I went, but you're working on a construction lot, and the game is called Lots, and if you put Lots into a search engine, with Lots. So that was a bit of a regret after, marketing and putting this whole thing together. This is a hard to come across. So yeah, in the future, I think I would go with something a little more unique as far as the name.
I mean, pricing of components and the searchability of names, these are challenges that are going to face any game for sure, and worthwhile considerations. Gil, do you think that there were any pitfalls that you have or that you can think of more specific to a city building theme?
Well, I mean, in my experience, the whole thing was made of pitfalls. Because I had a similar problem to Zach's in that I had a really ambitious plan for the game. Because the hook for the game originally were all these plastic pieces, these stackable plastic pieces that you were going to construct your buildings with. And backers didn't like the cost. It was too expensive for a game that I didn't have much artwork to show for at first. But the good news is I will have the game. I mean, by the time this video airs, it's possible that the campaign may be up already, but in October I'll have a campaign for the plastic buildings, which is going to be great, plus an expansion for High Rise, so that's going to be really cool. Similar issue with Zach I had when we put High Rise on Amazon. We would search High Rise on Amazon, and it would come up maybe like a few dozen entries down.
Yep.
But that's a lot of that is the more people click on it, the more it rises. So
right. The more it rises.
Yeah, as it high rises. Yes.
The higher it rises.
But one other.
Sorry, I couldn't let that go.
Yeah, of course not. Yeah. But I think one other issue that was really interesting was how much commentary do you want to put in it? Like, and what do you want to comment on, and what are you actually commenting on? Like, these are non-trivial issues. I'll give you an example. Heiko, my graphic designer, just amazing graphic designer, Heiko Gunther. He wanted it to be Manhattan. Like, he wanted to actually make High Rise set in Manhattan. And I pushed back against that, and eventually I vetoed it, saying, this is a game about corruption. And I don't want it to be a commentary on Manhattan. I'm not saying there was no corruption involved in the building of the Manhattan skyline. I just didn't feel that was the point of the game. And I felt like if I had done that, it would have brought in a subject matter that I don't think would have been relevant. It would have created conversations that I wasn't ready to have. So we made it a fictional city because that just... I wanted there to be corruption, but I wanted it to feel abstract, and I didn't want it to tie it too much into the real world, not because it doesn't happen and not because it's not worth talking about, but because I just didn't feel that was the point of the game.
Sure. And I guess any game, it's all about choosing your focus, choosing your priority, because you can only focus on so much. Now, James, same question to you. Do you think there's any pitfalls specific to the city building theme?
Well, so I would say that generally not, because actually I found that the fundamental idea of cities is quite easy to work with, in the sense that cities are all about location and things, how things are near other things and how they affect each other on some level. And that was actually quite easy to come up with some pretty good mechanics that worked in that fun. I found that bit quite actually, I was lucky that it all came very naturally. I had a much more specific problem, which was I'd created a complete rod for my own back, which was horrifyingly complex, which was that I wanted to create the idea of a dynamic property market. So I wanted a market that would somewhat push the game over time and time the game. So the game has a variable end time because the game ends when there's a property market crash. That's when it ends. But I wanted it at the same time to be something that was both timing the game, but also the players were somewhat in control of it, but somewhat at the whim of the market, all simultaneously. And it turns out trying to devise a system where players can influence the market somewhat, but also are subject to it, turns out to be one of the most horrifically complex things you can do in game design, because it creates a kind of feedback loop in a kind of mini economy where when players do things, they have kind of like in the real world, like outsized effects on subsequent actions, because I do something that influences you, which changes the market, which influences us, which changes us more, in this really fascinating problem. So getting the game to balance around that was horrifyingly complex, and it was like by far the biggest single thing. Most of the development time went into getting that piece right, not into any of the fundamental building mechanics, which all came to me, luckily, quite naturally. So however, I think it's a real achievement. I don't think anyone, hopefully, cross fingers, will copy it too quickly, just because it was a nightmare to actually make work, because it was something you basically couldn't balance a priori. You had to balance it by experience only, and that's a brutal thing to balance because of those feedback loops. So that was really the biggest challenge for me. But I think it's one of those things where it's like, well, anything that's worth having to some extent does require a bit of challenge, much as I think thinking about Zach and thinking, well, okay, this presents some real production challenges. But on the other hand, that because it is what it is, but if you can nail that, then you've got something that no one else has. And I think that's in general why I think some designers, myself, I sometimes see that they're sometimes a little bit afraid of doing things that are very difficult, and I don't think they should be, because that's where I think where some of the gold is myself.
I mean, for sure, we could have, again, this is, there's so much to unpack about the notion of, do you do a thing if you feel you can't do it well? Do you get scared off from those difficult challenges? And that's its whole thing. I think there's a question for everyone to ponder. But whether it's production issues and name challenges, or in your case, Gil, trying to work out the focus and make sure that you're not making a commentary on the city that you're living in, or indeed in getting that one little bit of your game to work out perfectly. It almost feels like maybe the challenges of a city building game aren't that unique to the genre. I mean, it's just the same as if you were making any other theme of game.
Yep.
Right. Yep. 100%.
So at that point, we start to think, okay, what is unique to city building? Are there certain mechanisms that you really want to have in? Certain mechanisms that just suggest city building well? Let's start with Gil.
James, let me ask you a question about your game. Does your game have things like commercial districts and industrial districts and residential districts?
It's actually a lot more free market than that, in the sense that the players, it does have all of those types of building, but the players are deciding whatever is commercially optimal for them to build in that location. But because each one of the buildings then has effects on things around it, you kind of get it tries to recreate the natural patterns.
Yep. Okay.
In cities, basically.
Because that, to me, is one of the defining mechanisms of a city building game, and yet only one of our games has it,
Yeah.
And even then,
exactly.
It's not really a big part of your game. So that's a really interesting thing. I mean, that's a big thing from SimCity, is I got to make sure that my residential areas aren't too close to industrial areas, but that they can commute over there. And let's put parks in the right spots. And for a lot of people, that is a city building game. For me, it was it's almost like what you expect from a train game. Like when you hear the words train game, do you expect 18xx? Do you expect more of a cube rails game? Do you include those in there? And then what about something like Ticket to Ride? Is Ticket to Ride a train game? Well, I mean, it's got a train theme and you're connecting routes, but is it a train game? And I think you can make the same argument with certainly my game, which doesn't have anything like industrial and there's no industrial or residential in my game. It's all commercial because it's all skyscrapers. You don't really have residential skyscrapers. You have residential high rises, of course, but they're going to go 40 floors, 50 floors. But once you get 100 plus stories, you really need those corporate clients to pay for that kind of thing. So yeah, for me, I never once had that mechanism in there because I just didn't feel like there was any room for it. And I think that yet is such a defining feature of a city building game. So without that, what's left? I think for me, the fact that, as you said before, Bez, at the very beginning, constructing and developing and seeing the city grow, that's one of the whole joys of High Rise, is seeing the city grow in front of you, because from the very beginning, it always had a 3D element to it. It always had a vertical element, and seeing the city grow in front and literally get higher and higher and taller, I think is another thing about a city building game that I think you'll really enjoy.
So do you want to jump in on that? Because I think that's spot on. And one thing that's really fascinating is, of course, actually all three of our games have that building element where there is a three-dimensional construction going on in all three cases. In obviously in your game, Gil, obviously it's going to be, I know particularly in the plastics, the tower's growing, but they already kind of change and grow already. You've got those massive kind of standees that I've seen. It's really cool.
Yeah.
And obviously, Zach, yours is the most kind of three-dimensional in that sense. Magnate's more like you just see the city emerge because it's all 3D buildings. But for me, that was critical. They had to be 3D buildings. I was like, no, these have got to be plastic miniatures. No other way to do this, because you've got to see that skyline that you kind of created. And what I think is really fascinating about that is that actually, if I were to pick the most famous city builder game, I think, in the modern board game genre, it would be something like Suburbia, which is completely flat.
Yep.
And has the idea that you are a mayor, right, in some sense. Whereas actually in each of our games, you're more like a participant in the creation of the city than the kind of master and commander of all you survey, which is how a lot of city builders are normally considered. So I just thought that was quite interesting that actually we've embraced the 3D element enormously, but actually some of the other mayor type traditional elements which don't touch at all.
But I mean, that's something with a lot of games recently, is how do you stand out? And the 3D, it's no different with games that are using these, as you described them, toddler-sized miniatures. It's about that table presence. What's going to make your game stand out as someone walks by at a convention or walks by at a store or looks at the back of the box, impressed by what they see? It's that 3D presence. Sure, you could just make a game like Flip City and just drop cards on a table and hope that the right number of cards come out and they work well off of each other, and then you're into your tile laying type of game where you're trying to get that efficiency. As Gil said, industrial areas next to residential, of these things. So it's like, it's all about the planning. But what we all did was try to be seen from across the room with that 3D. That's the hook of our games.
Yep.
Let me finish by asking you, Zach, does your game involve money at all?
It does not.
Because I was going to say, other than the aspect of growth and building on these buildings, because even if you're building a tableau or a personal kind of flat series of hexagonal tiles, you know, sure, it's not the same as having these standees that are literally rising high above the table, but there are certain factors that do tie into that sense of growth. The other factor that it strikes me might be the normal thing is to have some sense of commerciality to it all.
Yeah, as far as not having money in the game, this is a completely union shop. We're all paid the same wage. You know, some of us might work a little harder, and that's what the score track is, to show, you know, who's really put in the hours, kind of a thing.
I mean, my next question was going to be how important physicality is, and it sounds like we've all agreed that it's incredibly important.
These days, yes.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree, and I think it's partly just a product, I think, as Zach observed, of that you want your game to physically stand out. I think on a table in any game, whether that be a toddler-sized miniature game where you're fighting Cthulhu, because of course, or whether you're fighting whether you're building cities. But I do think there is something inherently in this genre where I've always felt like 3D was right for it. And if I'm really honest, it's because the reason I mentioned Suburbia is because it's a game that I really enjoyed, and I purchased as soon as it came out in Essen. I was one of those people who sprinted across the convention center to get the promo kind of guy, right? It's a great game, but I always felt like, well, but the whole thing about cities is that they're three-dimensional. That they are, that there is that you are often walking along and you're looking up. One of the things about skyscrapers is that they dwarf you.
Yeah,
that's part of the point of them. And I think so for me it was it became like the logical thing this genre had to have to some extent.
Which you could walk right past Suburbia and not realize it was even being played.
Yeah, exactly. So I think for me, exactly that. So I think for me, it's almost like it's the destiny of this genre to particularly go 3D, I think, in some way, even though it has broader commercial benefits.
And it's gone full circle now, because there's that deluxe version of Suburbia that is 3D, that does have the big components now.
Yeah, they've started to introduce that, exactly, which I think is quite interesting. Exactly.
So, do you think there's anything that you definitely shouldn't do if you were to make a city building game? I mean, is there any mechanism, whether it be dice rolling or, touching your nose or blowing, flicking? Is there anything that you can say, flicking, that's a terrible mechanism, definitely don't do that?
I would say look at the constraints that the theme gives you and work within those constraints. Like, for example, if your buildings move regularly, like if you say, okay, this turn you can move your building from here to there. Well, that's not a thing that buildings normally do. So I would avoid something like that.
No pickup and delivery, huh?
Not if the items are buildings, no. So look at the constraints that the genre gives you and work within those is my advice.
Now, with that said, you could do an interesting trailer park version of a city building where you pick up and deliver these buildings.
And it's funny also that I mentioned that because in my expansion, one of the tenant powers that I'm suggesting is indeed to move a building to the suburbs and then build in that location. But that's more like, I call that rezoning. So
this goes back to something you said earlier on. Like, we have these definitions, we have these guidelines so that we can break them, so we can draw inspiration from them. By the way, dibs on the trailer park game.
It's all yours.
Go for it.
I mean,
exactly.
Of course, if you wanted to do a pick up and deliver game, it could be, okay, whilst this city is starting to thrive, there's a secondary game going on of actually feeding the residents and moving the people around. But I love what you're saying, Gil, of tapping into the assumptions that someone would make based on the fact that, yes, these are buildings. They are going to not move. They're not going to do anything super exciting. They're going to maybe grow potentially, but that's pretty much it.
Right.
I
James.
was just going to say, I think that's really wise advice, because I think to some extent, I don't think there is, provided what you're doing isn't causing explicit injury to people, I would say there is nothing you can do wrong to some extent. But the things that will tend to not work will be anything that's like working against all the time the theme, which is why I completely agree with Gil, because I think if you can come up with the flicking city game and it makes sense, like, wow, great, do it. Like, that's awesome. Go for it. Make it work. Probably not. I mean, that sounds more like the kind of like Godzilla destroys the city kind of
Terror
game,
in Meeple
or
City.
something. Yeah, exactly. That's what that sounds like. But I think that's where I would say, and I think, so you do whatever you can, right? And I think just it's working within that constraint will just force you to be creative, I think, and that will take you down some interesting avenues.
I mean, for sure, if you want to pick a mechanism that clearly won't work and then you force it to somehow work, well, maybe it's a Terror in Meeple City, but maybe it's a 1 against 1 where one person's the monster rampaging, the other person's actually trying to rebuild a city. That could be a thing.
Exactly. A kind of endemic Godzilla that you have to kind of live with. That's just like always there, and it periodically comes along, and you're like, oh god, he's knocked down a couple of skyscrapers again.
We've actually been testing someone's game on Tabletop Simulator. I'm not looking to give too much away about it, but he's working on something very similar to that, where there once was a city, it's been destroyed by monsters, and now you're grabbing all the rubble and trying to rebuild your own little city over here.
Fantastic.
So it's that go into the city, pick up, deliver it to you, use it efficiently. So again, we use these things to break the mold. We're all just designing inside the same box.
Yeah, completely.
I'll say this, I tried preparing for this question because I was really interested in this one as far as what not to use. One of them, while discussing here, I actually kind of backtracked on. I was going to say storytelling should never be used in city building, but then I was kind of thinking a pitching game about why my building should get the zoning here. Like, this is a thing that actually happens in city developments.
Oh my god.
Have these residential meetings, I'm looking to...
Or it could be microscope,
here.
something like that, where instead of building an entire world, you're building a small city.
Yeah.
Right. But I will say, I still wholeheartedly, and this might just be because I hate them with an undying passion, dice. Dice. This is a city building game. This is about planning. I want to be able to plan. I want to know what I can do, what I'm working with, not, I rolled a 4. I didn't need a 4. But then you take something like a Machi Koro, where you're using the dice. You're building a tableau of city, and based on those dice is what you're able to do. So there's always ways to work around it. Granted, Machikuro is probably one of my less favorite city building type games.
You know, Tasty Minstrel released a game called Skyline by David Short. It's a little dice game that I think was just supposed to be an add-on to a bigger game that they had released, and I forget which one it was, but Skyline was such a little gem. It's one of my favorite city building games. It's just a simple dice game.
And it's about throwing dice?
It's about rolling dice, and the dice you roll tell you what buildings. And then to construct the buildings, you actually stack the dice to construct the in-progress buildings, and then once you decide the building is done, then you take a tile and put it in front of you, and that's your completed building, and you return the dice back to supply. The problem is it's something like 100 custom dice of 3 different molds, so it wasn't cheap to make, and so it didn't have much of a life, because in order to justify that, a game like that has to sell a lot, which is a shame, because I thought it was a phenomenal game. It was really one of my favorite city building games.
See, this is fascinating because Zach, I have to admit, Magnate does use dice, and the reason why it uses them is because it wants to simulate what it simulates specifically is the attempt by property developers to get tenants to move into their buildings. Right. So, and because this is like a really.
I'm not saying don't use dice. I'm just saying dice tend to use me. And I appreciate it so much.
That's always the problem with them, isn't it? The little is that this is what they do. But I think that's a really good example again of what's really fascinating is that the city building genre has both of those aspects, right? It has the planning aspect, like the idea that somehow it's all centrally controlled and managed, which games like Suburbia really drive in quite far, particularly, and I think probably also, I guess, also in High Rise is the idea of the planning of these companies and what they're going to do. Whereas in and then you've got this other conception of it is that I guess is how cities are made by their participants. And how you try and model something that's a lot more uncertain, that's going into a more planned framework. So I think it's just really that just shows you. I think all the way through this discussion, it just constantly makes you think, God, this theme is so rich. Yeah, it's such a rich scene to mind of all of those things.
To me, is that there are no truisms. We can say don't do this, but then we can think of situations in which it would actually work really well. Then we can say, hey, don't use dice. I don't like dice, but maybe if it's simulating the environment rather than limiting your own choices. And what occurs to me is that ultimately it's about being judicious and being mindful about the mechanisms that you use. Now, as we start to wrap up, I want to ask you in turn, do you have any closing tips for folk who would like to try their hand at making a game in which you're making a grand city? Gil.
Oh, me first, huh? Same as any other game, manage expectations, manage the intersection of theme and mechanism, know what your players are thinking they're sitting down for when they sit down and play the game, and work within those bounds, and also try to not make your components too expensive, because that absolutely matters. But at the same time, make your components distinctive so your game stands out. Good luck.
As you say,
good luck.
As any other,
you can sign off right there. Good luck.
Make a good game. Now, James.
So I think for me, I completely agree with everything Gil has said. I would just say, when you're picking your city building genre, pick what aspect of city building really excites you. Because I think the thing is, if you're trying to go for a design that's maybe quite ambitious, and I actually feel like you should try and go for something that's not been done before, you're going to have some real tough times. And I think, given that, you need to make sure you're doing something which really motivates you, and you would be fascinated to bring that aspect of cities to life. So I'd say if you keep focused on that, and then you do all the very sensible things Gil has said, I think you've actually got a bloody good chance of making something really good.
It's a good shout. And Zach, anything to add?
Nothing specific to city building, but just game design, publishing in general. Get it to the table as quick as possible. I know we even spouted off a few ideas here while discussing city building as a genre. The best idea you have isn't worth a tenth of the worst game you've ever put on the table. You have to see work with each other, how the components interact, how the players interact, and you can conceptualize it right down in your design journal till the end of time, until you put something on a table and see, does this clock, does it work?
Yeah.
I like that. We could say, a game on the table is worth 10 in the mind.
Yeah, I like that.
Oh,
Yep.
love
Very
it.
nice.
So,
Love
one at would you want to make another city building game, Zach?
Yes, I actually am working on another city building game. So this was moderately successful for me, even though it's a small time operation here. I am working on a roll and write version of it because it's less expensive than conventional blocks. But trying to capture the essence of the building and using the blocks efficiently, I'm trying to do that with a roll and write game so that I can build off of this brand a little bit.
Gil, are you going to make another completely different game after this one?
That's my MO. Like, I don't like to do the same thing several times in a row. So, I'm already working on my storytelling RPG. I'm working on a few secret projects for IP holders. There's a bunch of stuff, and none of the things I'm working on are remotely like the stuff I've done in the past. So for me, it's wherever I lay down my hat is my home. Rolling Stone gathers no moss, that sort of thing. I'm just gonna keep on moving and try totally different things because that's what excites me and that's what intrigues me.
And I'll be excited to see what you get up to.
Thank you.
James, will you work on another city building game?
Well, I would love to expand Magnate because I have an absolute treasure trove of things that I think would work potentially quite well in it, that I think would be very amusing and interesting. I don't know that I would massively want to make a city building game again. Outside of that, a completely different one, because I think like Gil, I'd probably get to be honest, a bit bored, and I'd want to do, and so I think versions, brilliant. Actually, a whole new city building game, probably there are loads of other new, fresh thematic fields to harvest, and I feel like there are definitely there's so many things I want to do, so many, that I probably wouldn't make another completely separate game.
That sounds like a good shout. And so, with that being said, we have to wrap up. So before we leave, let's go in alphabetical order. And I'd like to ask all three of you if people are excited to see where you will rise up to, or want to be their own magnates, or to have lots of fun with your things.
Excellent.
How will people find you, Gil?
You can find me at Gil Hova on Twitter. You can look for Formal Ferret Games on Facebook. FormalFerretGames.com is my website. You can sign up for my mailing list there. And I have a weekly Twitch stream. So every week you can see me play sometimes my games, sometimes other games from other designers that I enjoy.
James.
So, if you want to kind of follow me and sometimes read my occasional design blogs, which are hopefully getting back into now a bit more, then you can find me on Twitter at Naylor James. And I think if you're interested in Magnate particularly, then I would go to the Magnate Kickstarter page. You'll find Magnate the First City at Kickstarter, and you'll be able to get through that link to pre-order the game if you want to do that, especially with the Tycoon expansions. And there's loads of material also that you can link through to websites and reviews that you can read on that page too.
Zach?
If you don't want to reach me, you should find me on Twitter at Royal. I'm very rarely on Twitter. But if you ever want to talk, I'm on Facebook, Zach Connelly. I'm kind of always on Facebook. And I'm always excited to talk about games.
Cool. And I am stuffbybez.com. It's my main website, stuffbybez.bigcartel.com, where you can buy my stuff, twitter.com/stuffbybez. I tweet a lot, instagram.com/stuffbybez. Pictures of things I'm working on, things I'm playing, or just pretty things around London, and twitch.tv/stuffabez. I stream actually 10 a.m. UK time every single day. I've been doing that now over 100 days, so for most of lockdown. And facebook.com/thingsbybez is a thing. With that being said, I should remind you all that if you want to see more talks like this, please go to https://www.tabletopgaming.co.uk and check out what Tabletop Gaming magazine has to offer as part of Tabletop Gaming Live this weekend. And as we wrap up, there is only one thing left to do, and that is to sing bye 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 bye. This is a goodbye song. Bye,
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 bye, bye.
bye.
Thank
This-
you for watching along. Bye, 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 bye. This is the end of the show. Bye, 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 bye. And now it's time to go.
Woohoo!